I was 9 years old when it happened, but I remember it like it was yesterday. My parents have told me their side of the story so many times over the years that it feels like I lived through both parts, their panic and my fear. My mom and dad were scientists. They worked in a huge old government building that was used for research on the environment. Their job was important. They studied nature and helped create laws to protect it. The building was massive, filled with labs, offices, and expensive equipment. Because of all the valuable stuff inside, security guards worked there 24/7 to make sure nothing got stolen. During the day, the guards mostly greeted people at the front desk, but at night, they walked through the entire building, checking for intruders. There was one security guard who always seemed really nice to me. He had a friendly face, a big smile, and he was always kind whenever I visited my parents at work. Whenever my mom and dad had to stay late, he would sit with me at the front desk, keeping me company. He was great at making paper airplanes. Seriously, it was like he was a professional at it. He'd fold them quickly and make them fly across the room like magic. I thought he was fun. I thought he was safe. My parents must have thought the same because they trusted him with me. That turned out to be a big mistake. One night my parents were working even later than usual. It was already past 10, and I was getting restless sitting at the reception desk. The guard, the same one who had always been so nice to me, suggested I go with him while he did his rounds. It sounded more interesting than waiting around, so I went. We started at the top floor, walking through dark hallways. Every time we entered a new room, he turned the lights on, checked around, and then shut them off as we left. I stayed close, behind him because the darkness made me a little nervous. As we moved down to the second floor where my parents' office was, something about him started to change. He seemed excited. His pace quickened and his voice got lighter, almost playful. I noticed he was checking rooms faster than before, like he was in a hurry. By the time we reached the basement, my stomach felt weird, like I had swallowed a rock. The basement was colder than the rest of the building. It smelled musty like old books and chemicals. The walls were lined with cabinets, and large machines filled the room. He led me to one of the bigger labs and quickly grabbed 2 sheets of paper. With his usual skill, he folded them into airplanes, then with a grin he tossed one across the room. "That one's yours, go get it," he said. Without thinking, I ran after it. The second I reached it, the room went completely dark. At first, I froze. Then my heart started pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape from my chest. I turned around quickly, expecting him to turn the lights back on. Instead, I saw him standing outside the glass door. He looked at me for a second. Then without a word, he locked the door and disappeared into the hallway. Panic hit me all at once. I ran to the door, pounding on it with my fists, screaming his name, begging him to open it. I could hear my own voice shaking with fear, but he didn't come back. Through the glass, I watched him walk down the corridor, flipping off the lights as he went, one by one, until the hallway was completely black. And then he was gone. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I pressed myself into the corner, hugging my knees. Every little sound made me jump. My brain started playing tricks on me. Shadows seemed to move. Strange shapes appeared in the darkness. My breathing was loud in the silent room, and I had no idea how much time was passing. Meanwhile, upstairs, my parents had finally finished their work. They packed up their things, chatting about heading home, assuming I was still at the front desk waiting for them. But when they got to the lobby, I wasn't there. The security guard was, though, sitting at his desk like nothing was wrong. My mom immediately knew something was off. "Where's my son?" she asked. The guard just shrugged and said, "Oh, he was with me during my rounds. He must have wandered off somewhere." Wandered off? in a building that took over an hour to search from top to bottom. That didn't make any sense. My parents went from confused to furious in seconds. My dad was shouting, demanding to know where I was, but the guard kept repeating the same thing. He must have gotten lost. Panic set in. My parents ran through the building, searching every floor, every lab, every office. They called my name over and over, but of course I couldn't hear them. I was still trapped in the basement, curled up in the dark, terrified, and alone. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Hours, probably. But then, finally, I saw something. A light. It was faint at first, barely there. But it was coming from the far end of the hallway. Hope surged through me. I jumped to my feet, ran to the door, and started pounding on it with everything I had left. I screamed as loud as I could. And then, I heard footsteps. Voices. The lock clicked and the door swung open. There were my parents. My mom's face was pale, her eyes red. My dad's hands were clenched into fists like he was about to punch someone. The security guard stood off to the side, avoiding everyone's eyes. I ran straight into my mom's arms. I didn't want to let go. That night, I refused to sleep alone. My mom stayed in my room, sitting on the edge of my bed, rubbing my back until exhaustion finally took over. The next day, my parents filed a complaint against the guard. That's when the truth finally came out. Turns out he wasn't just some friendly security guard. He had been stealing computers and important information from the building, working with criminals to sell the stolen equipment. He had already taken a lot of stuff before anyone even noticed. But what haunts me the most is wondering what he had planned for me that night. Locking a kid away in the dark isn't something normal people do. And the way he had been acting, rushing through his rounds, getting more excited the closer we got to the basement, it makes me think he had something worse in mind. Maybe he planned to come back for me when the building was empty. Maybe he was going to get rid of me so I wouldn't tell anyone what I had seen. I don't know. And I don't think I ever will. But I do know one thing. That night could have ended very differently. And I'm just grateful it didn't. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was my very first job as a waitress, and I was so excited to start working at a small diner in the middle of the town. This was right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, so things were already a bit strange. But it was my first time doing anything like this, and I was pumped to learn the ropes. I was a bit nervous, of course, but mostly I just wanted to do a good job. I was working alone most nights with just one cook in the kitchen. He was about 20 years old, and we'd usually be the only two people in the diner by the time the sun went down. That suited me just fine. I preferred working by myself. It felt easier that way. I didn't get along with most of the other waitresses, so being alone made things a lot simpler for me. I liked the peace. It wasn't until later, when my shift was winding down, that something happened that would stick with me forever. It was one of those moments when everything just clicks, and you realize your instincts were trying to tell you something all along. I wasn't always great at trusting my gut. Something about my anxiety made it hard for me to figure out if I was overthinking or not. But that night I knew something wasn't right. And looking back, I'm thankful I had that feeling. It started like any other day. I got to work around 3 p.m., said goodbye to the other waitress who was finishing her shift, and got ready for mine. Things were slow at first, just the usual. Mostly empty tables, a few regulars. Everything was calm. But then, the phone rang. A woman called to ask about one of the special dishes we had on our limited time menu. She was upset when I told her that we couldn't offer it as takeout. After some arguing back and forth, she reluctantly agreed to come in and eat at the restaurant. She wasn't happy about it, but she did. About 20 minutes later, I saw a car pull up outside and I immediately recognized her. She was the same woman I'd spoken to on the phone. She came in with two men. Both looked to be in their 30s or 40s. I could tell she was still in a bad mood, but as soon as she saw me, her attitude completely shifted. Suddenly, she was all smiles, polite and friendly, which struck me as a little weird. Most people act that way when they're trying to impress others, right? At first, I didn't think too much about it. I showed them to a booth, took their orders, and that's when I noticed something strange. The woman had a red binder and a black pen with her. It seemed small, but for some reason it made me feel uneasy. I didn't think much of it then, though. I was busy with my other tables and just focused on doing my job. After I served their food, the woman asked me if I knew any real estate agents. It didn't seem like a big deal. People visiting here were often looking for vacation homes. I gave her the number of a realtor I knew from church. We had a few more small interactions, nothing too unusual. They weren't exactly rude, but something about them kept nagging at me. Around 4:30 p.m., they were the last people left in the diner. The day was coming to a close, and the cook and I decided it was time to take a break. We stepped outside for a few minutes to relax. The restaurant had this ramp in front, which was there because the building was a little raised off the ground. We stood at the top of the ramp talking. The cook was chatting with one of the men, and I stayed where I was behind the railing. I didn't notice it at first, but one of the men had pulled my cook to the far side of the ramp out of view. The other two, man and woman, were standing right in front of me, about 5 feet below. They started asking me personal questions, things like if I lived nearby, how old I was, if I smoked. It all seemed kind of random. I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't really know how to get out of it. I answered vaguely, trying not to give too much away, but they kept pushing for more. It was at that moment that things started feeling a little more off. I wasn't sure what their game was, but I could feel it. Something was just wrong. Finally, the woman got to the point. She told me she had a business offer for me. I run a maid service, she said, and I'm looking for young girls like you to help out. We pay 30 grand, it's a great opportunity. I froze. I mean, who talks like that? The offer didn't make sense. Something about it didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on it at first. She kept talking, trying to convince me how easy it would be, how much money I could make. She mentioned her van and said I could come see it if I wanted. That was when it clicked. I realized what was really going on. This wasn't about a maid service. I didn't know exactly what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I declined her offer quickly, telling her I liked my job and didn't need any other work. But she wasn't ready to let go. She kept pushing, telling me again how much money I could make, how easy it was. She even told me to follow her to her car to see the pictures of her van on her phone. I don't know why she thought I'd go with her after all that, but I knew better. I wasn't going anywhere near her or her car. I refused again. Finally, she seemed to get the message and ended the conversation. She and the two men left without another word. But I was shaken. I went back inside and told my cook what happened. He laughed it off, joking that I could have made a lot of money if I went with them. But I wasn't laughing. It didn't sit right with me. That night, the cook's grandmother came to pick us up. She overheard what had happened and her face changed. She went pale, then sat there staring at me silent. I asked her what was wrong, but she just looked at me like she was in shock. And that's when she told me something that made my stomach drop. She told me that what had just happened was an attempt to recruit me for human trafficking, that the woman and the men had been trying to get me involved in something really dangerous. I was lucky I hadn't followed them. My heart stopped. It felt like the world was spinning. I had no idea how close I had been to being dragged into something awful. The next day I went to work again, still shaken by the whole thing. But when a new customer walked in, I had another weird moment. This man was different from the others. He was dressed nice, nothing too fancy, but well put together. He sat down at a booth by himself and ordered just one coffee. He had a red binder and black pen with him. I didn't think much of it at first. People have odd habits sometimes, but then my cook, who had been there the night before, pointed out that it was the same red binder and black pen I'd seen the woman carry. I tried not to panic, but I couldn't shake the feeling. This man stayed there for hours. He just watched me as I worked. Every time I passed, I'd ask if he needed anything, and he'd tell me no. It was strange, to say the least. Then he started talking on the phone. I wasn't supposed to listen, but I couldn't help overhearing. He was talking about moving money around, finding a new house, and how he'd pay his girls that night. My heart raced. I ran to the back to tell my cook what I had heard, and we quickly made up a plan. We had to keep this guy from getting any ideas, so we distracted him while we worked. After a little while, the man left, and that was the last I saw of him. I didn't realize just how lucky I was to get out of that situation until much later. Now I'm much more careful, and whenever something feels off, I trust that feeling right away. The last thing I want is to ever find myself in a dangerous situation like that again. It was back in 2013 when I found myself in a tough spot. I was struggling to finish my education, but every internship I applied to turned me down. It felt like I was running in circles. I had to find something else to do, though, because I couldn't let my bills pile up, and I needed to make sure I could put food on the table. So I took on another job. A friend of my girlfriend's family had a small business, a bus service for people who couldn't drive themselves. It was a kind of taxi service for people in wheelchairs or those who were disabled in some way. The guy was looking for someone to cover the night shift since he needed to keep the bus running almost all day and night. I was always awake late, so I figured it would be a good fit. I got the special license I needed, and just like that, I was hired. The job itself was pretty straightforward. Pick people up and drop them off where they needed to go. Sometimes I had to use a lift to help get people's wheelchairs up and down the stairs. When there weren't any passengers, I'd park the bus in a quiet spot and just wait for the next job. I found a truck stop nearby where I could park and catch a quick nap. There was a gas station where I'd grab some coffee. In the early hours to keep me going, and just across the lot, there was a rundown diner with an old motel attached to it. The place wasn't much to look at, but it was quiet, and that's all I needed. After parking there a few times, I started to notice something odd. One of the rooms in the motel always seemed to have people coming in and out, like there was something going on in there. I didn't think much of it at first. People come and go all the time, right? But one night I was half asleep and I suddenly heard shouting coming from that room. I rubbed my eyes and saw a guy burst out of the door, stumbling and running as fast as he could. Not long after, a much bigger guy came charging out, chasing him. The big guy was holding something in his hand, but I couldn't tell what it was. It didn't look good, though. I wasn't about to get involved, so I just rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. I thought it was probably nothing. But then, my phone rang. I had a trip to take, about an hour away, so I started the bus and drove out of the parking lot. As I was leaving, I saw the big guy walking around the corner of the motel. My heart skipped a beat. Something about it didn't sit right with me, but I shrugged it off. I had to keep working. The rest of the night went by without a hitch, and I didn't get back to the truck stop until around 2:30 a.m. When I pulled into the lot, the place where I usually parked was covered in rocks. Big ones, like someone had just thrown them all over the place. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but it was definitely strange. I parked a little further away and tried to fall asleep again, but I wasn't able to stay asleep for long. A car pulled up right in front of my bus. The driver honked his horn loudly, flashed his high beams in my face and revved the engine, all like he was trying to mess with me. I figured it was just some idiot who thought it would be funny to wake me up. But when I didn't respond, the car didn't leave. Instead, the driver pulled back a little, as if telling me to move. That's when I put two and two together. The rocks, the guy I'd seen earlier at the motel, and now this. Something was off. I wasn't about to back down. I opened the bus door and stepped out, ready to tell the guy off. But instead of driving away, the car just sat there. The high beams were blinding me, and I could barely make out who was in the car. I stood still, not wanting to show fear. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, the car finally drove off. I felt the adrenaline rush through me as I watched the car disappear. That was it. I wasn't parking here anymore. From then on, I decided to park by the trucks. They were always parked in a row, and I figured it would be safer there, at least until all this weirdness blew over. For the next month, nothing unusual happened. It seemed like everything had returned to normal, and I started to feel a little more comfortable. Then, one Sunday, I had a 12-hour shift. I started at 6 p.m. and didn't finish until 6 a.m. It was a long shift, and I didn't have time to grab dinner before work. The first part of the night was packed with back-to-back trips, so by the time I finally got a break, I was starving. I parked the bus at the far end of the lot near the trucks and pulled out the dinner my girlfriend had packed. I sat with my back against the driver's side door and leaned back, getting comfy. I was so tired, but as I sat there scrolling on my phone, trying to relax, I accidentally hit the lock button on the door with my elbow. I didn't think anything of it, but a second later I heard the unmistakable click of the door handle sliding back into place. It wasn't a sound I was used to. I turned around and my heart dropped. There, crouched behind my bus, was a man with a hood pulled low over his face. Without making a sound, he slowly crawled under the bus, holding a big kitchen knife in his hand. I froze. For a second, I couldn't even move. My mind raced, and I knew I had to act fast. I jumped to my feet and made sure all the other doors were locked. I kept an eye on him, hoping he wouldn't try anything, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I couldn't let him get any closer. I started the engine, turned on the lights in the back of the bus, and looked outside to see if that would scare him off. It worked. I watched as the man crawled out from under the bus and ran toward the trees at the edge of the lot. My heart was still pounding in my chest as I waited for what felt like forever before I finally saw him disappear into the shadows. I didn't stick around to see if he would come back. I drove out of that truck stop as fast as I could and made sure I never parked there again. From then on, I made it a point to lock every single door the second I parked. No more taking chances. That night taught me a lesson I would never forget. Always trust your instincts and never let your guard down, no matter how safe things may seem. I was only 16, just a kid really, when this happened. It was my first job at a small rundown pizza place in town. It wasn't anything special, but it paid better than other places, and I could make extra money with tips when I did deliveries. On the night this all went down, I was just trying to get through the shift, doing the same routine I'd done 100 times before, taking orders, delivering pizza, and chatting with the regulars. Around 9:30 p.m., we got an order for delivery. The address looked familiar, but not in a good way. It was deep in the woods, far from any real road. It was the kind of address I dreaded. The people who lived out there were always a little off. But hey, it was my job. So I grabbed the food and hopped in my car. The drive out there was worse than I thought. The road kept getting narrower, with trees closing in on both sides. I swear it felt like I was driving into nowhere. After what seemed like forever, I finally spotted the house, almost hidden behind overgrown bushes and tall trees. It was huge, but old, one of those houses that looked like it had been around for centuries. The kind of place you wouldn't want to be caught alone in at night. I parked in front of the house and stepped out. As soon as my feet hit the porch, it hit me. The silence. I've been to a lot of places, but this was different. No crickets, no wind rustling the leaves, just dead quiet. I could barely hear my own footsteps. It felt wrong. Then I saw it. The front door was wide open. Not just cracked or left a little ajar, but completely open, as if someone had walked out in a hurry and forgot to close it behind them. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I should just knock and leave the pizza on the porch. But before I could decide, I heard a voice from inside. "Hey, could you bring the pizza in? I'm just setting the table." It was a man's voice, calm and friendly, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I had delivered food to people before, and most of the time they'd just step outside to grab the pizza. But this guy was asking me to come inside. I knew it wasn't exactly okay to go in, but it didn't seem like a huge deal. Maybe he was just being polite. Plus, if I brought the pizza in, he might give me a better tip. So, against my better judgment, I decided to go in. The moment I stepped inside, I knew I had made a mistake. The house was dark and cold, even though I could tell it had been nice once. The hallway was narrow and everything felt off. It was so quiet, too quiet. No TV in the background, no footsteps, nothing, just silence. I walked down the hall to the kitchen and set the pizza box down on the table. I expected the guy to show up, but he didn't. There was no sign of him. I just heard him talking, so I figured he was somewhere nearby. I looked around, but it was like I was the only one in the house. That's when it got really weird. The voice called out again. "Can you bring it in here, please? I'm almost done." I froze. This time, the voice was coming from a different part of the house. It was deeper down the hallway, coming from behind another door. The door was cracked, open, but the room inside was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, just darkness. I could feel my heart start to race. I didn't know what to do. Should I go closer? Maybe he really needed help. But there was something about the whole situation that felt off. Why hadn't I seen him yet? Why wasn't he in the kitchen with me? It felt like he was hiding from me, like he didn't want me to see him. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the door, trying to decide if I should walk into the darkness. I almost took a step toward it, but then my gut told me, no. Something was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I needed to leave. Fast. I didn't even hesitate. I turned around, nearly tripping over my own feet as I rushed back out the front door. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to take a few deep breaths before I could start the engine. I didn't say anything to anyone about what happened. I was too scared. I didn't want people to think I was crazy or worse, laugh at me for being paranoid. But even now, looking back, I know something wasn't right with that guy. The way he called out from that dark room, the way I couldn't even see him. Everything about it felt wrong. I'm just thankful I left when I did. I have no idea what would have happened if I'd walked into that room. Honestly, I don't want to know. I used to work as a security guard for a small startup company. Honestly, I had no idea what the company actually did. I was just there to keep an eye on things. The whole situation felt a little odd to me because the office was so small and looked completely ordinary. It didn't seem like a place that would need a security guard, but in a way that made my job easier. I didn't have to worry about patrolling multiple floors or anything like that. I'd start my shift at 9 p.m. every night. My first task was to turn on the security alarm systems and then head to this tiny security room where the cameras were set up. The room was very basic and wasn't much to look at. The cameras only covered the outside of the building, and the quality was terrible. I could barely make out anything on the screens, but at least I could keep an eye on what was going on outside. The first couple of hours of my shift were always the same, boring. I'd just sit there and watch the cameras, sometimes looking at my phone or zoning out. Nothing ever happened. But that night, things took a turn. Around 1 a.m., I heard a strange noise, like the sound of a latch being clicked. It was so quiet, at first, that I wasn't sure if I had really heard it, but I sat there in silence for a moment thinking. Then I realized it wasn't my imagination. I stood up from my chair, confused, and walked out into the hallway to investigate. The hallway was exactly how I had left it. There were 3 doors down the hall, and they were all shut tight. Nothing seemed out of place. I walked over to each of the doors, opening them slightly to peek inside. Each office had rows of desks and everything appeared normal. But still, something didn't feel right. Maybe I hadn't heard anything at all, I thought. Maybe I had imagined it. I went back to the security room, but this time I left the door open to the hallway so I could hear if anything else happened. I sat back down and kept an eye on the cameras. I even rewound the footage from the last few minutes to see if I missed something, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds, nothing. I started to feel silly for even thinking something strange had happened. Another 20 minutes passed and I was starting to relax, thinking that whatever I had heard earlier was probably nothing. But then, suddenly, I heard it again. A faint creak. It was the unmistakable sound of a door opening slowly. My heart skipped a beat. I jumped up from my chair and rushed out into the hallway, still in disbelief. I couldn't believe I was hearing the same sound again. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw one of the doors slightly ajar. My confusion only grew. The alarm hadn't gone off and the cameras hadn't picked up anything unusual. I stood there for a second, wondering if I was going crazy. I was sure no one could have gotten in without triggering the alarm system, yet there I was looking at an open door in front of me. I cautiously walked over to the door and pushed it open a little further. The office was dark, and there was no sign of movement. I stepped inside, trying to make as little noise as possible. I scanned the room, but it was eerily quiet. I kept walking deeper into the office, passing rows of desks. It wasn't until I reached the back of the room that I noticed something. A faint shadow moving on the wall. I froze. Before I could even process what I was seeing, I turned my head, and that's when I saw him. There, crouched under one of the desks, was a man. He had black hair and dark circles under his eyes, and the moment we locked eyes, I could feel a strange mix of fear and anger radiating off him. It was as if he was both scared and mad that I had found him. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the man started to stand up. I had no idea if he had a weapon on him or what his intentions were, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I turned and bolted out of the room, running as fast as I could down the hallway. My heart was pounding in my chest. I reached the front doors and slammed them open, setting off the security alarms. The sound of the alarms echoed in the empty building as I ran outside. The moment I was clear of the building, the system sent an automatic notification to the police. I kept running, not stopping until I was a safe distance away from the office. I turned back to watch the front doors, hoping the police would show up soon. About 30 seconds later, I saw the man burst through the doors and start running. He dashed around the building, and I lost sight of him. Not long after, the police arrived, and we reviewed the footage from the security cameras. To our surprise, there was no footage of the man entering the building. There was no sign of him at all. We had no idea how he had gotten inside or when. The company seemed just as confused. They didn't know anything about the man, and they said nothing was missing from the office. That left me with a lot of questions. Something didn't add up. Why would they hire a security guard for such a small office unless they knew something was going to happen? I had a hunch that maybe the man was an old employee, someone who had a troubled history with the company. It felt like they might have been hiding something from me. I stayed at the job for a few more months, but eventually, I found a better job and decided to leave. Even though I moved on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story that I would never know. To this day, I still wonder what really happened that night. It was one of those experiences that sticks with you, leaving you with unanswered questions and a lingering sense of unease. At first, I wasn't excited about the idea of working the night shift. It sounded lonely and boring, but the extra pay was too good to turn down. My department was rushing to meet a big deadline, so someone had to stay late to keep an eye on things. I volunteered, thinking it would just be a few hours of peace and quiet to get some work done without distractions. The office building was pretty standard, nothing fancy. It had rows of cubicles, a break room with a coffee machine that never worked, and the usual buzzing fluorescent lights that gave everyone a headache. During the day, the place was loud and busy, phones ringing, people chatting, keyboards clicking. Away. But at night, when everyone else had gone home, the building felt different. It was quiet, way too quiet. There was something strange about being in an empty office at night. The cubicles stretched out like a maze, and the dim emergency lights made weird shadows on the walls. I could hear every little sound, like the building creaking and the soft hum of the air conditioner. Even my own breathing felt way too loud. At first, the silence was kind of nice. I liked being alone, working without any interruptions, but after a few nights, I started feeling more isolated. And then strange things began to happen. One night I was sitting at my desk working on a report when I heard a rustling sound across the room. I looked up, expecting to see one of the cleaning staff, but the office was completely empty. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably some system in the building making noises. But then, the sounds kept coming. I could hear papers shuffling, and chairs creaking like someone was moving around, even though I knew no one else was there. It was so subtle at first that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but once I noticed it, I couldn't ignore it. I got up and walked around the office, checking all the cubicles, but there was nobody there. I told myself the building was old, so it was probably just the walls settling or some other noise from the building systems. But then things started getting even weirder. The next night, I came back from a short break to find all the papers on my desk scattered across the floor. At first, I thought maybe I had knocked them off without realizing it. But when I bent down to pick them up, I saw something strange. The papers weren't just scattered. They were laid out in a way that looked intentional, like someone had placed them there on purpose. A chill ran down my spine. I was the only one in the office. At least I was supposed to be. I checked the security system and saw that all the doors were locked and nobody had entered or left the building since I arrived. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, the footsteps started. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I was sitting at my desk working on spreadsheets. The only light was from my computer screen. I was focused on my work when I heard it, footsteps echoing down the hallway, getting closer. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I listened carefully, wondering if it could be someone from the cleaning crew, or maybe another employee working late. But no matter how hard I tried to listen, I didn't hear any doors opening or any sounds of cleaning supplies. Just footsteps. I stood up, my chair creaking as I pushed it back. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding way too loud in the empty office. No response. I stepped out from behind my cubicle and peeked around the corner into the hallway. It was empty. The footsteps had stopped. My heart was racing, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was hearing things because I was tired. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I went back to my desk, but I couldn't focus anymore. Every little noise, the hum of the air conditioner, the ticking of the clock, made my nerves jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me, but there was no one. A few nights later, things got even worse. I was sitting at my desk trying to finish up a report when I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving across the wall behind me. It was quick, just a flicker, but enough to make me turn around. There was nothing there. I turned back to my computer and tried to keep working, but the shadow kept appearing just out of sight. It was like someone was standing right behind me, but when I turned, the room was always empty. The worst part came one night when I saw the reflection in my computer screen. I had been staring at my work when I noticed something behind me. Just in the corner of the screen, it was the outline of a figure. I spun around so fast, my heart pounding, but the office was still empty. The lights were low and the reflection had been clear, like someone was really there. That's when I started to panic. I called security, asking them to check the cameras, but they found nothing. No one had come in or left all night. I was the only one in the building. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was always watching me. Every time I came in for my shift, I felt like there were eyes on me, even though I knew I was the only one there. I started hearing whispers too, soft voices calling my name as if someone was standing just down the hall. But whenever I checked, no one was there. The footsteps kept happening, almost every night, walking up and down the hallways, stopping, right outside my cubicle. Sometimes they'd just stop and I'd sit there frozen, feeling like someone was waiting for me to move. It all came to a head one night after seeing another shadow pass by my window. I decided to find out what was going on. I started asking around and learned that years before, an employee had died in the building. She had been working late just like me when she had a heart attack. No one found her until the next morning when the cleaning crew came in. She was still sitting at her desk, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The story sent a chill through me. Could it be her? Was she the one haunting the office? I tried to brush it off as just an old office legend, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just a ghost story. The whispers, the footsteps, the shadows, they all started happening after I took the night shift. And they were getting worse. One night as I was finishing up a report, I felt it again, the presence, that feeling of being watched. I looked around, but the office was still, too still. Then I heard it, a soft voice, whispering my name. Turned toward the sound and the lights flickered. For just a moment I saw her, standing at the far end of the office just outside the glow of my desk lamp. Her hair was hanging limp around her face and her eyes were wide and vacant. I froze. I couldn't move. My heart was pounding. She took a step forward, her feet making no sound on the carpet, and the lights flickered again. When they came back on, she was gone. I didn't think, I just grabbed my things and ran. I didn't care about my computer or locking up. I just needed to get out. After that night, I told my boss I couldn't do the night shift anymore. I didn't give him a reason. No, need to. People still work late in the office, but no one stays alone after dark. The cleaning crew still has their stories about footsteps that shouldn't be there and shadows moving in the hallways. But no one talks about it much. As for me, I found a new job in a new building. I don't work nights anymore. But I'll never forget that face, the empty eyes staring at me. And I know deep down she's still there,